Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, O Lord, and they shall be created.
And thou shalt renew the face of the earth.
Let us pray, O Lord, who enlightens the hearts of your faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit. Grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever enjoy his consolation. Through the same Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Our Lady, help of Christians.
Pray for us.
Saint Paul.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
So on the Lord's Day, we come to praise God with even greater zeal than usual, or at least we ask for this gift. The Lord gives us this time each week to stop and rest. But how much more so on this time, or during this time of retreat. In this particular meditation, we want to pray about how important it is to have great desires, humility and peace. Desire, is as old as the human creation. We are made and meant to have desires within us. There's desires for greatness, desires for beauty, desires for achievement. And it's actually an old, very, very ancient idea that I guess philosophically was spoken about by Plato, and the eros, that drive to all things which are good and true and beautiful. The human spirit wants to surge beyond itself. Well, we also must have great desires for holiness if we are going to get there. If we are not filled with desire, with a longing that comes from deep within us to achieve great things for love of Christ, then what will happen? We settle into a comfortable mediocrity. And I'm sure that we've all seen this happen. Someone starts off very zealous, full of desires for holiness, full of desires to want to do great things. And then they realize that it actually takes a lot longer to achieve something great, a lot of planning, a lot of work. We look at what happens with athletes and so forth. To achieve just a gold medal, how much they work, how relentlessly. But then what happens in the spiritual life, the fruits may be slow in coming. And then a person can begin to ease off, to lose that original drive, that spark. And the desires begin to wane, and then they perhaps think that, well, this is not for me. This is too much for me. Maybe this is the aim or the object of a greater soul than I am. And then they do away with it, and they stop trying. And I'm sure we've all seen examples like this. I know I certainly have. And it's sad and tragic to meet perhaps sometimes a fellow priest or religious who started off, no doubt, very energetically and zealously. And then sometime in their life they settle for a mediocrity. And they justify the mediocrity by saying, well, I was immature, I was naive, I was idealistic. As if somehow idealism is not as much a part, or doesn't have a place rather, in somebody who's middle-aged or elderly, as it does in the heart of a younger person. Idealism must always be there. But experience should temper it. It modifies it. It helps us to make idealism or ideals realistic. It's true, we can start off with ideals that are just out of this world, The child who thinks that dad can do anything asks for the moon, Can I have the moon? Yeah, right. I will when I work out how to do it. But great desires for holiness is also a very important quality because it comes from deep within. We need that push. So in order to give Jesus love for love, we must be souls of desire. Nothing great ever comes about without great desires. They are the mainspring, the driving force. If they are lacking, everything is dull and lifeless. We must desire to be not only good, but holy. Perhaps you will not know how to express these desires with ardor. The essential thing, however, is that you be filled with them. Let's just pause for a moment. We've been on retreat now for a few days. Hopefully we've had a chance to rest, to eat well, to exercise, to be able to pray. But if I were to ask you now to just pause and see what is the desire of your heart right now, what would you say? Are you aware of any desire? Any longing? Perhaps you might just be open to whatever comes, which is in itself a recognition and openness to the Lord, and a desire to want to listen to Him. That would be a good thing. Is there some perhaps joy inside of you that is longing to grow even more, or a feeling of love, a yearning for love? But what desire is there? Because a soul without desire is indeed in a bad way. I remember one time when I was still working overseas, and I was doing a lot of spiritual direction with students. There was a student who came who had accumulated so many advanced credits, they used to call them. Practically half of his degree was done already in high school. And he comes and, he's got all these credits. He could finish his degree in probably 2 years or maybe 2.5 years. The degrees over in the US are 4 years long. You do all these these general studies in the first year. And I remember I was just talking to him. I said, "Where is your longing?" He had no fire for anything. I said, "What excites you? Does anything light your fire? Do you have any desire to do anything? Is it?" And you know what? He couldn't come up with anything. He was only in his late teens, and I just thought, wow, you are in a sad way. And anyway, he only came a few times, but it was really sad for me. And because I thought, I can't do anything with this guy. I can't do anything. If somebody has a desire, a fire in the belly because they're very angry, there's a passionate character, I could do something with that. If there's a passionate character for love, wanting to serve, there's a drive there. But somebody who doesn't have any drive at all, that's the lukewarmness. They've become insipid. And we know what Christ does with someone like that in the book of the Apocalypse. Because you're neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. What will men do? What will men not do to gain public recognition? How many steps and sometimes how many compromises? Yet all that is for a temporary fortune, a fleeting enjoyment, for the glory of a moment, a puff of smoke. And sadly we see this happen all too often amongst politicians, but indeed anybody in public life. The athletes who work so hard to achieve in their sport, but you see that it's very often for very vain and simple sort of ideals. Recently I received a news bulletin, and there was a story about, I think it was a football player, and he's doing an interview. He's a very successful football player. He's doing an interview with his baby son. I think it was, number 8 or 9 in the family. It was just beautiful to see a handsome young man strapping, who's a father of a large family and in the public life, and he's so comfortable looking after his little, 6-month, 8-month-old baby and giving a press conference about the sport. I thought, this is a man who has his focus on the right ideals. He enjoys the sport, he works hard, but his family is first, and he brings them into it with him. I was talking to a politician recently, and she was saying that, and she's a good, faithful politician who wants to actually do something good for the community and who's a devout Christian. And she said to me, Father, politicians like me, or people like me, aren't made in politics. Meaning by that if you don't already have it before you go into politics, you're not going to get it in politics. Because sadly, the game is so different and often focusing on other things. The ideals often in politics are not the high ideals that lead to real building up, even though that's often spoken of, and they would have us believe that would be the real desire. So our desires must be for holiness. Our desires must be for longing for a union with Christ. And we must fan into a flame these desires within us. Whatever is there, we must ask the Lord will increase it for us. How many souls I have met who have experienced these beautiful enthusiasms, yet in admitting their weakness, their apparent mediocrity, their lack of progress, have let themselves, little by little, be overrun by discouragement. There's that word again. A few meditations ago I was saying one of the devil's greatest techniques, discouragement. The garage sale. Discouragement. They say, holiness is not for me. I believed it was. I wanted it, but I must come down a peg. And the devil seizes on this and profits by such an abdication to make them give up the fight and to break down every good impulse. And that's sad, it's tragic. In our younger years, we are naturally filled with a spirit of generosity, a willingness to achieve great things, because it's that phase in life. But as we grow older, energies become less, and we do become more realistic, and experience and the knocks of life also teach us to temper certain things. But this longing for holiness is something that should keep on growing and becoming deeper. The saints who also experienced many knocks in their lives, many discouragements, but never let those discourage them. So discouragements will come our way. That's just part and parcel of life. But we cannot allow them to discourage us. And that's why in the face of these things, wherever we find ourselves today on this retreat, we have to ask the Lord if we are feeling enthusiastic with desires for holiness, to thank God that He has preserved us in this. If perhaps we have begun to lose some of that shine, or perhaps have lost it for years even, and we've just cruised along, let's ask Him, Lord, restore me, bring to me that initial fervour that I had, that desire for holiness, which is a great desire, because it's a desire for the greatest things. You. As St. Paul describes it in other ways, he says, we play, and he's saying how the athletes do this for a wreath that will wither, but we do it for a crown, a glory that will never fade away. Of course, face to face with God, we have not a single right, yet the expression of my rights comes so easily. We have a thirst for esteem which is never quenched, a natural desire to be acknowledged, to be appreciated. These obvious truths remain practically hidden from us. Right reason grasps them, but in the habitual practice of our thoughts, blinded as we are by our passions, by our interests, and by the love of ourselves, we forget our absolute creaturely dependence. This is because we do not look at the things that we do not like to see. We do not like these truths, yet when we look at them in the face with the eyes of the Divine Master, what peace we shall find in them. So what is this cause that sometimes our desires, in fact, get washed away? The great desires that perhaps once upon a time filled our hearts, the desires for holiness. And it's often because there's a lack of humility deep down, a real lack of humility. And it's good for us to define from the beginning that humility doesn't mean putting ourselves down. The best definition I've come across with humility, or about humility, is from St. Teresa of Avila, the first woman doctor of the Church, that humility means to walk in the truth. Walking in the truth. I think andar en la veridad in the Spanish, as a Spanish priest once explained it to me. And what does that mean, walking in the truth? Wherever we see the truth about God, the truth about each other, the truth about ourselves, and particularly the truth about ourselves can be a very elusive thing, because human beings, while God has put a limit to their intelligence, He has not put a limit to their stupidity. So and that can be true of all of us, that our appetite for self-delusion can be very, very big. We can have ourselves on because we don't like to see the facts, the truth about ourselves as we really are. The disordered self-love, the preoccupied with my own comfort, with my own wishes and desires. I want myself to be looked after, but I don't want to reach out for others. I don't want to pay attention to this person or that person because they annoy me, or I don't find them interesting in conversation, whatever it happens to be. But these are all truths about ourselves, deep truths about ourselves. And there's something there that the love of God has to burn away and remove. The saints learned to rejoice in humility and humiliations, for humility and love of humiliations are of a piece. A confessor once said to me, "Mark, there's no humility without humiliation." And while the two don't have to be united together in some kind of doctrinal or logical way, they often are in practice. Humility often comes through humiliation, because humiliation breaks through that delusion that we construct about ourselves, this idealized image of who we are, and it breaks through and pops the balloon of the ego and makes us realize, you know what? You're not such a hotshot. You're not the greatest thing on earth. You're not this, you're not that, as you thought you were. Ouch. I didn't expect that. And so humiliation, in fact, should lead to humility, although there's no guarantee. Again, I've seen people being humiliated, and yet there's still such a deep pride inside that they don't want to admit it. And it's sad, because God has to break in through that as well. Once upon a time, St. John Vianney asked God to show him what He thought of him. And he said, and He began to show him. But after a while, I began to get so discouraged. I was on the point of despair. I had to ask Him to stop, because I couldn't bear it any longer. But He's left me with enough knowledge of who I am so that I will never be puffed up. And this St. John Vianney is the one who, would work miracles. Of course, God works the miracles. He's just prayed for them. And people are attributing miracles to his face. He was completely unmoved. He was utterly convinced it's God who gives the miracles. I've just prayed for them. And we see this very much in the saints. But that's a man who had truly been transformed. Contempt and indifference, even more than contempt, is hard, and indifference is hard to accept. We must swallow the bitter gall of being left aside as insignificant, while the idol of self is obliged to bow its head. But in this state of death for our nature, there is also a taste of divine life, because it is in the measure that we die to ourselves, that we live in God, that Jesus takes a greater place in us. St. Francis of Assisi, imagining that on arriving at the monastery with little brother Leo, they would not be received, that the porter would not open the door for them, that he would leave them outdoors in the snow, or worse than that he would chase them away, cudgeling them with sticks, said to the little brother, "That would be perfect joy." Okay, and that is but little compared to what I would call the cudgeling of the soul, the lack of esteem, the ironies, the injustices of those with whom we live, whom we love, yet who nevertheless humiliate us, often without intending it. So a simple example in the life of St. Francis. I hadn't come across that before, but it's lovely to think the saints never had this expectation. Oh, I'm the great founder of the Franciscan order, you should open the door for me. That is arrogance, that's pride. And St. Francis, the true saint, knew that. And very often our own brothers and sisters will humiliate us. They will say things, they will overlook us, they will do things without intending it most of the time, but it can be offensive, it insults us. And if we know how to take these things properly, it will actually do us a lot of good. But what happens oftentimes, I'm licking my sores, oh, poor me, I've been overlooked, I've been insulted. She does that again, she did it before, she never learns, he never learns. Well, another story comes to mind about Saint Therese, as she was dying. The mother, and some of you may have heard this story before, but the prioress at the time, when a sister died, would write a few verses about the sister who died, and then that would be sent to the other Carmels, the other monasteries. And anyway, so Therese was there in the bed, and she was, I don't know how many days before she was dying, or before she died, but she heard there were two sisters talking outside the door, and the door was open, and she could just hear. And one of them said to the other, "What will Mother Prioress write about this one? She's never done anything." And St. Therese heard this, and she was filled with joy, because it meant all her secrets of goodness, what she'd done for love of God, had not been recognized by anybody. And she thought, which means now all the reward will be granted in heaven. It's that whole thing that your left hand must not know what your right is doing, what Jesus says to us in the gospel. Why is that? Is that so that good can be hidden? No, it's so that by not getting the thank you now, we will get it later on. So it's not about not having an ambition for God's glory and for a high reward in heaven. I hope you all have a big ambition for glory in heaven. I know I do. And long may ask God to grant you as much joy and glory as He can. But in this life, it means we must go unnoticed. And that's Saint Therese of Lisieux for us, that little example. To practice this is a difficult thing, to not be pained by being overlooked or by an injustice, not to protest, not to take offense, not to complain. Under the pretext of dignity of justice, what hindrances we place in the way of humility. Because in that moment, we forget what we're really trying to do, to become holy. Do we want to grow in humility? And so we think, no, it's about justice. I must correct this situation. You know what? Some situations need to be corrected. But other times, it's just not worth it. Because the other person is probably not going to hear what we have to say, and because we might need a lesson as well. There was an old dictum or phrase, a saying from the Middle Ages, and it was particularly important for various popes. I think the one I heard it about was Saint Paul VI. And that as Pope, he would say, be aware of everything. Change a few things, overlook most things. Be aware of everything that's happening in the church. Change a few things, overlook most things. The higher someone is in the area of leadership, the more important, I believe, this phrase becomes for them. Because there are very few real changes that one person can bring about. But it's important, of course, that they're aware of all the things, or as many things as possible, that are happening. And it means, in practice, they will need to overlook most things. Even when we look at someone as great as St. John Paul II, who was an intellectual genius, a saint, a great teacher, but we see that there are some things he didn't do well. Some things he left undone. And it wasn't because he wasn't aware of them. I think he realized, what are my limitations? What are my strengths? And he had plenty of them. Plenty. But certain things he just couldn't do and didn't do. And that's important for us when we come to our own interior life. That certain things we shouldn't worry about, because we're not going to be able to change them. But to change what we can change, and to let go of the other things. Or as that old serenity prayer says, Lord, grant me the things, to see the things that I can change. Let me get it right now. Lord, grant me to see the things that I can change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Sorry, grant me to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Oftentimes we don't want to. Sorry? Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to refine the quote. But that's it, Sometimes I think, perhaps oftentimes, we get preoccupied with the things that actually we cannot change. And then the things that we can, we overlook those things. We don't. And that acceptance is so important for us in our lives. The humble man realizes that he does nothing good in the supernatural order by himself. That applause is bad for him. It seems to him that it is a sort of stealing, because we're taking the recognition that really belongs to God. That's why it's like a stealing. Humility makes us aware that it's not mine. All good comes from the beloved King, with a capital K, evil from himself. This is justice and truth. He realizes it with joy and peace, with the same simplicity. Thinking of the graces he has received, he will say, Fecit mihi mania qui potens est. He who is all-powerful has done great things for me. Let us remain very remote from all that glitters, wrote Little Therese. Let us love our littleness. Let us love to feel nothing. Then we shall be poor in spirit, and Jesus will come seeking us. However far away we are, he will transform us into flames of love. She warns us in another place in the story of a soul, her autobiography, how easily vanity can seep into the soul. And so we must practice this, What does it mean? You might think, well, when somebody praises us or gives us a compliment, does that mean we should respond by saying, oh, no, it's not true? That's false humility. false. So we should be gracious about it. Say thank you, thanks for saying that. But inside, to train ourselves, if we don't do it already, to thank God, thank you Lord, that this person sees this. Thank you. This is your grace. It's your goodness. You know, St. Augustine, in his preaching, he wrote, and it's amazing. I remember when I first read this, I thought, wow, a great saint. My estimation for him grew even more. He says, in my own, how did he put it? He says, my own estimation, or in my own view, my preaching is very ordinary. But, he says, when I see the effect on the people, I realize, that there's something more there. And he wrote another point is, you're really moving people when you're moving them to tears. The impact of God's word spoken. But that's the great example of St. Augustine, a man who had experienced a lot of brokenness in his life and who had reached great holiness towards the end of his life. In fact, later on, as he was a lot older now, there was a meeting of the bishops in North Africa. St. Augustine died at the age of 76, so 354 to 430 AD. Anyway, and he spoke at this meeting, and he said, I know many of you think I've made great progress in the spiritual life, that I no longer struggle with the things that I did in my earlier years. And he said, would that it were so. I still struggle now with the things that I struggled before. And so it can be a fallacy to think that some struggles are just for our youth, and then others for our middle years, and others for our elderly years. That's true with some things. Other things, we will keep on struggling with them, perhaps till the day we die. At least it was true of St. Augustine, whatever those things were. And again, when I hear those things being said, he had obviously made great progress, but he had gone so deeply into his own interior life, and the light of God was shining so brightly that he could see that he still had a long way to go. Even towards the end of her life, when St. Therese was being told, you're a saint. You're a saint. You know what she said? She said, I'll believe that when I hear God say it. Because she knew how deceiving people's compliments can be. I mean, who really knows us well? Yeah, those who live with us, okay, they know us to this point. But they don't know what really goes on inside. God knows every thought, every movement, every motivation, everything. So that's why when God says it, then I can believe it. Because in God there is only truth and there's no lies. And he knows all the truth. Whereas everyone else who thinks they know us, they only know a part of us. Even if they know us very well, even an intimate friend, a lifelong friend, or a spouse, or a family member, all these, they only know to a certain degree, and then only God knows everything. How many women have gone astray because of their physical beauty? How many men because of their brilliant intelligence, their talent, their eloquence? I think of that when I meet a homely person who, throughout her whole life, has never seen a look of admiration or interest resting on her because she is ugly or infirm. And I look at her and say to myself, how beautiful she will be in heaven. If she could only see the look of tenderness Jesus gives her simply because she is counted for nothing by those for whom only the success of this world counts. If she knew how to accept with faith and love what God has chosen for her, what glory she would have above. Some great saints have been abundantly gifted, St. Augustine and St. Thomas, who were geniuses, and many others besides them too. St. Teresa of Avila was beautiful, a marvel of natural grace and wit. St. Dominic apparently was strikingly handsome and very intelligent and a great organizer, a great leader. St. Francis de Sales, an exquisite being with refinement of intelligence and delicacy of hearts and manners. But I think that these gifts served especially to help them fulfill their special mission in the church, and that they were saints in the measure to which they realized the gratuitousness of the gifts, in other words, how freely these gifts were given by God, and their own fundamental poverty. St. Thomas considered all his theological works as straw. In the last 2 years of his life, this is a man who wrote on average, he was 49 years old when he died, and on average he wrote 1,000 words a day, and he did not write rubbish. He had a mystical experience about 2 years before the end of his life, and he had a vision of the Trinity. He asked for that, and he said, after what I've just seen, and Christ had said to him, Thomas, you have written well of me. What would you like me to do for you? Oh, give me a vision of the Trinity. There you go, have it. He says, after this, everything I've just written seems like so much straw. The saints knew how to use their great gifts at the service of God, and they never forgot that. So, as we recap and come to the end of our meditation, great desires are important for us. And we should ask God to kindle those within us, a longing for heaven, a desire to serve, a desire for holiness every day, every day, every day. And our flesh will cry out, our pride will get in the way, our vanity, whatever it is. But then this is where humility must come to the rescue, and we seek to grow ever more deeply in this, to say thank you to the Lord should some humiliation come our way, should some insult, some misunderstanding. Yes, initially we're going to want to fight the situation, but eventually to come and to see, Lord, help me to learn something from this. Help me to grow in this. Help me to see the good that you can bring about in this. And at the end of it all, what's it all for? To bring about that peace, the peace of Christ, a peace that the world cannot give. This is my gift to you. Amen.